Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this WIOA Wednesday webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Today's topic is draft supplement guidance for PY 2021 from the Governor's Office with KEB. With Bethany Yeager, and we welcome her today as our presenter. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. All attendees are on listen-only mode. If you have questions as the webinar proceeds, feel free to post those in the Q&A or the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the webinar when we have our Q&A session with Bethany and some other people from her team. Just another reminder that this webinar will be recorded, and the presentation, recording, materials from today, handouts, and slides are all located on the website that I have posted in the chat. That same website will also be given to you in a follow-up email tomorrow morning, and it's just our center's website, which is Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. You can access today's slides via that link as well if you would like to download them and follow along. They are the first slides on that webpage. Just another quick reminder, if you do experience faulty internet connection this morning, or you find yourself experiencing audio connection, you can always feel free to call in using the phone number on your original registration email. And with that, I'm going to start us off with a couple of beginning polls that we like to do for every WIOA Wednesday webinar. And so the first one, I'm going to launch it. We would just like to know where you're joining us from today. So we have some broad categories for you, but just your general area of where you're joining us from today. And then we'll kind of share that poll so we can welcome all of you. We'll give everyone a couple more seconds to answer this poll. Okay, and I'm going to share the results so we can all see where we're joining from today. So we have the majority of us from Central Illinois and some from Northern and Southern and Chicago, Illinois. And so, oops, we had a mishap on the second poll. It's supposed to just be Northern. So hopefully you guys clicked the right option. But that's really just for our analytical purposes. And so we can welcome those from all over the state this morning. And then we'd also like to know which partner do you best represent? And so you can choose between Title 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or if you're from a different WIOA partner and stakeholder, we would love to know that as well this morning. So we'll give everyone about 10 more seconds to answer this poll. Okay, so we're going to share the results with this one as well. So most of you are joining us from Title I this morning, and a couple others from across the board. So we would just like to welcome all of our attendees. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning on this beautiful Wednesday. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our presenter for today, Bethany Yeager.
Good morning, everyone. This is Bethany Yeager. I'm a consultant with KEB. We're based in Springfield, but we work statewide. We at KEB facilitate the WIOA Interagency teams, which consist of all representatives of all the required programs under WIOA. And we also provide technical assistance to workforce partners to help them comply with the law of WIOA and state policies if that's needed. Today's webinar is to present a draft version of what we call Supplemental Guidance. This guidance is specific to program year 2021, which starts July 1st, 2021. It's called Supplemental because it adds to the guidance that already exists in what is known as the Governor's Guidelines. The full name of that document is the Governor's Guidelines to State and Local Partners Negotiating Costs and Services under WIOA. We simply call it the Governor's Guidelines. It's important to note that those Governor's Guidelines remain the authoritative guidance and are still applicable to guiding MOU negotiations and negotiations about how you'll share costs in any program year. What the supplemental guidance does is offer guidance that's specific to program year 2021. So during this webinar, I am going to explain more background about the Governor's Guidelines, and also I'll highlight the draft supplemental guidance specific to program year 2021. The most important thing to know of today is that this is the draft version. We are presenting the draft version of the supplemental guidance to you because it is really important for us to get your feedback. The Interagency Technical Assistance Team works with the feedback that we receive through this webinar and any follow-up questions that you send to us after, so that we can understand from your perspectives throughout the state what's feasible, what's reasonable, and how can we implement any of these changes with undue burden, to avoid undue burden. So we need your feedback to make this a really applicable, helpful, useful guidance, but still help you comply with the regulations that are spelled out in WIOA, in the guidance, and in state policy. After we go through that draft supplemental guidance and seek your feedback, then we'll review the timelines one more time so you remember how this negotiation process works and how this guidance will support you as you prepare for the next year's guidance negotiations. And then at the end, then we'll take Q&A, both through the Q&A box and in emails that you send to us after the fact. And the TA team, the interagency TA team that consists of all the required partners, will consider all of your questions, and we'll put responses in writing for all to see. And we'll call that the Frequently Asked Questions, which is FAQ, which is on the WIOA implementation portal. And you will get notified when the FAQ is issued. So that's what we'll talk about today. On the next slide, we are this is just providing some background about the Governor's Guidelines. We understand some of you might be new to this process. Many of you have been in this process multiple years now, so this is just a little bit of an overview again, a reminder. But for those of you who are new to the Governor's Guidelines, under WIOA, the Governor is required by the law to issue guidelines to support all of the required partners in negotiating two things. One is how they will make their services available and accessible through the local workforce systems. And then two, how will they share in the cost of operating the local workforce system. That includes what it will cost and what the partners agree to pay for to operate the American Job Centers. So this is a negotiated MOU, which stands for Memorandum of Understanding. That's the overview of what the Governor's Guidelines is about. It also provides resources. The Governor's Guidelines provide resources that can hopefully support you and your staff and any negotiators of the MOU in following the process and complying with the requirements under WIOA. So note that the last couple of boxes on this slide list a glossary. If you want to know the definition of infrastructure costs versus service delivery system costs, the glossary will tell you that. If you want to know the difference between affiliate sites versus access sites, the glossary will also tell you that. So the glossary is a resource for you, especially if you're new to the MOU negotiations process. Also note that the Governor's Guidelines include forms that are required. Early in the implementation of WIOA, we heard that there was a desire for an MOU template. So that MOU template is issued as part of the Governor's Guidelines. And yes, from year to year, there have been some changes to that MOU template, again, to try to work off of the feedback that we receive to accommodate any new guidance that comes out from the federal government or any other clarifying or streamlining that is possible as we all get smarter in this 4th year of WIOA implementation. So the important thing to know about those forms that are issued as part of the governor's guidelines and any supplemental guidance to them is that the forms are located on the WIOA implementation portal. That is where all of the fillable documents are available. That's where the most recently issued forms are available. So we encourage you to go to that portal anytime you're ready to start filling out the form to make sure you have the most recent version. On the next slide shows a little bit more of the history that I was talking about with the governor's guidelines in Illinois since WIOA was enacted in 2014. On the left hand of the slide in blue, you see that there have been 4 major revisions of the governor's guidelines. This major revision is necessary. For example, if the Department of Labor or the federal government issued new guidance. That was the case early in the process, particularly related to infrastructure costs. So that required new guidance, completely new guidance, so we called that revision 1 and 2. Another revision was occurred because we had all this different informal guidance that we knew existed. We wanted to bring it all into one place. So 3 and 4 were really about bringing the resources into one guiding document, streamlining some of the guidance so that, again, based on feedback, we knew what was working, what was not. On the right hand of the side, that explains a little bit more about supplemental guidance, really, again, specific to program years for very specific reasons. And these tend to be more technical changes, not revising the entire document, but just technical changes that will support you in the upcoming program year. And that's what this webinar is about, the draft version of the supplemental guidance to guide you in PY 2021. On the next slide, we have a little reminder about what the MOUs are about. A big part of the governor's guidelines are about how to negotiate commitments that required partners make and are documented in the MOU. The MOU is really where the rubber hits the road. How will the partners commit to implementing some of the plans that were, and goals and initiatives that were described in the regional and local plans and in service integration action plans. So the MOUs serve as a tool to service integration. They reflect a shared vision and a commitment towards not just of the required partners, but also of the local workforce boards. They also document those commitments to service delivery and how many FTEs or full-time equivalents that each partner will commit to allow that service delivery to occur. And the MOUs demonstrate in good faith efforts to negotiate how the partners will share in the costs, and that each partner, each party to the MOU has the authority to commit those financial commitments for service delivery and operations of the one-stop system. So the most important thing to remember is that the MOUs are negotiated every 3 years. The terms of the MOUs last 3 years. The shared cost, the annual budget, is an annual budget. So the budget that accompanies the MOU has to be updated and amended annually into the MOU. So we'll explain a little bit more about that throughout the webinar. So the next slide explains the decisions that are reflected in the MOU, services that can be accessed in the local service delivery system, locations where those services are made available, each program partner's method of delivering those services. Is it in person? Is it through direct linkage technology? Is it through a contractor? The role of the one-stop operators is spelled out in the MOU so partners understand how services are being coordinated. The coordination of referrals accompanies that section. How are partners going to refer and coordinate the referrals to each other throughout the local workforce system? That commitment is made in the MOU. So there's a section in the MOU template that also asks you to say, okay, you have this service integration action plan that partners agreed. These are the ways that we're going to integrate our services. The commitments in the MOU are about how you're going to operationalize those commitments. Again, where does the rubber hit the road? It's one step lower in detail, deeper level of detail about how you're going to actually implement the goals that were set in the service integration action plans. And again, the partners' cost-sharing commitments are in what we call an MOU budget. Formally, that's called the one-stop operating budget. That includes both infrastructure costs and service delivery system costs. And the MOU also has a narrative to explain how those costs are going to be shared. So that's the overview and the background of the governor's guidelines. Again, I know many of you are very familiar with that. Others may be new, so we want to make sure that you have the background you need. If you need more background about the governor's guidelines or the requirements of individual required partners, please contact KEB. We can work with the Interagency Technical Assistance Team to provide an orientation. So next I'd like to highlight the draft supplemental guidance. We are presenting again this draft version for the sake of getting your feedback. And again, we'll get that feedback in through the chat box live during this webinar, or if you're watching a recording of this webinar, you can email the designated email address that will show you to submit your questions so that the TA team and KEB can support the TA team in responding to those questions in writing. So there are 5 parts to the draft supplemental guidance that are listed on the next slide. And this is how the draft supplemental guidance is organized. Kirsten, can you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. The 5 parts are first about the COVID-19 pandemic and the implications for service delivery and cost sharing. So this is, we know, a factor in the current program year, and we're trying to look forward to what we can anticipate and what guidance might be helpful as you think about the next program year. There's also guidance for public safety measures. This is what we have called the reopening checklist for American job centers, and we'll walk through that a little bit more. This supplemental guidance, the draft version, is intended to incorporate that checklist into the supplemental guidance. The supplemental guidance will just formalize it. It doesn't necessarily have major changes, it's just formalizing that that guidance is now officially part of the supplemental guidance to the governor's guidelines. And while many and most people have been working remotely over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was another need. There's always been a need, but now there's another need to raise the level of awareness about what universal design for service delivery means and looks like, and how you can consider that when you're thinking about negotiating service delivery in the next program year. So we'll offer some resources about that. There's another section, section 4 of the supplemental guidance draft version, about guidance for one-stop operator payment provisions. We'll walk through that and tell you the status of those, the draft guidance related to one-stop operators when we get to that section in this webinar. Then the last section of the supplemental guidance relates to what you might need to consider or be reminded of as you prepare for negotiations that usually begin preparing in December, and then negotiations officially begin in January. So we'll offer some reminders about getting started there and what the overall timeline is. So I'd like to start by looking at the first section, the draft guidance for shared costs during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that the pandemic had immediate and obvious impacts on service delivery and raised a lot of questions about cost sharing and safety, first and foremost, while staff suddenly had to work remotely. So this guidance, if you advance to the next slide, Kirsten, this guidance is intended to support you in hopefully what we have learned through that process. We know that all the changes that you had to make were very quick, and there wasn't time for full negotiations among the partners about how you would continue services or how you would share in the cost given the complete change in service delivery and the environment altogether. We also know you had to buy extra supplies or cleaning services or security or whatever the case was on short notice. And again, there wasn't full time to negotiate those as required partners. So at the same time, we knew the pandemic was not going to be a short-term problem. Or we learned that soon after the shelter-in-place order was implemented by the governor. So we knew at the technical assistance team level that we needed to consider guidance that could allow the flexibility that you would need to continue to adjust your services repeatedly throughout a program year, and as long as the pandemic continued. So the WIOA Interagency Technical Assistance Team issued about a month or so after the shelter-in-place order guidance that as you prepare, that we issued guidance in May or so, 2020, that we think can still apply to what you need to consider for PY 2021. So, for example, we think looking ahead for PY 2021, it's best to try to talk early about how and whether required partners will jointly share in any unplanned or unbudgeted costs that are going to be required for the duration of the pandemic so that you can continue operating. So 3 examples of the unexpected costs are on the bottom left side of your screen. They are increased sanitation supplies, face coverings for employees and or any participants that are served in person, or maybe additional security presence, knowing that there could be long lines of frustrated people who are stressed or dealing with unemployment because of the pandemic. So all of those things were real life issues we know that you have dealt with and could still have to deal with for many more months. So what we are recommending in this draft supplemental guidance is on the blue side of the screen. Consider in your negotiations the things such as which pandemic-specific costs benefit the entire American Job Center versus one required partner's program needs, and which pandemic-specific costs will be shared among all of the required partners through an allocation process. Or identify, are there any agreed upon exceptions for partners that will not absorb any of those pandemic-specific costs? If so, the guidance or the draft version of the supplemental guidance says it's best to document those just to be clear about what you're sharing, who's not sharing, and why, and to show that there was agreement about that. Also discuss any special processes or timelines that are needed for seeking approval of costs that maybe were not originally budgeted, especially when you need a state agency to reimburse you for those costs. It's really important to work with the state agencies. If you could advance to the next slide, Kirsten. Ideally, you would identify what the pandemic-specific costs you're sharing first, and then you would go back and be able to track those actual costs that you agreed to share. But the point that we're making here is just to be prepared that before you seek reimbursement through a state agency or a state-administered program, you need to confirm the invoicing process ahead of time. And we know things have had to change during and after the shelter-in-place orders. So confirming that invoicing process before you seek payment through a state agency is really best early in the process. On the next slide, there are a couple of questions that came up early in the process of understanding the COVID-19 response throughout the American Job Centers. So we thought we'd go through those just briefly and explain how they're addressed in the governor's, the supplemental guidance draft version. This question that's on the slide relates to infrastructure costs. which are the operating overhead costs of the physical American Job Center. So this is leases, utilities, maintenance, property insurance, cleaning services, security, those costs that are necessary to run the physical American Job Center. So the natural question is, if the center is only open for a limited amount of time by appointment only or not at all, then do the partners have to still pay the infrastructure cost to operate the physical building? The answer is yes, that the required program's cost-sharing commitments for infrastructure costs must still be met, even if the center is not fully open to the public or open at all to the public. The center still has to be operated and maintained, and those commitments have to be honored. The next question on the next slide is related to something similar. When program staff have been working remotely and are not physically present in the American Job Center, but they're still making services available through technology or other means, does the program, the required program, still have to share infrastructure costs? And again, the answer is yes. The governor's guidelines have established that any program staff, even before the pandemic, any program staff, whether they are working physically in the American Job Center or working remotely through technology, they still count towards the required program's FTE commitment. And those FTEs are the basis on which your program is allocated the shared costs among all required partners. So it is important to understand that the commitments you make in the PY 2021 budgets and MOUs, those obligations and those commitments have to be honored. And if an amendment would be needed to the MOU, then all partners would have to agree on that amendment. On the next section, this is another example of guidance that was issued early in the shelter-in-place order and that we're now suggesting should be formalized in the draft supplemental guidance. And it's regarding PPE procurement, especially because we know PPE was an unplanned and necessary cost that you had to do on short notice. So the guidance that was issued in May still stands true now in this draft supplemental guidance. PPE, we think, is still best procured at the local level, but you have some options that are described in the narrative of the supplemental guidance, the draft version, and that are on the screen here. The local workforce boards still have to follow their established procurement policies and procedures to get that PPE. The second one is that local boards can procure PPE from their known sources in the local area and the provider list that you already work with. Another option is that local workforce boards may be eligible to procure PPE through existing state agency master contracts through the Illinois Central Management Services, or CMS. That joint purchasing authorization applies to units of local government and qualified nonprofits, including nonprofits that act on behalf of a board established or controlled by a unit of government or receive grant funds through the state or a unit of local government. So that option exists even without the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it's highlighted in the supplemental guidance draft version that that's still an option as long as the PPE is available. And there's a list that Illinois Central Management Services maintains, and the link to that list to make sure that you have the most recent version is available through the WIOA implementation portal that actually has a COVID-19 section and has a procurement of PPE resource for you on that webpage. And it is listed on, that webpage is listed on this slide, and that is available also on the WIOA implementation portal. Next, there are some considerations for security. This starts to relate to the guidance that was issued in what we call the checklist. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a few slides. But the draft supplemental guidance also tries to provide a little bit more formal guidance about how American Job Centers and the required partners can think about security and whether there's a need for increased security. We know every local workforce area is different. We know each American Job Center has its own intricacies of how it operates and how security is provided. So what this draft supplemental guidance is suggesting is that the required partners should just continually assess whether there is a need for increased security at an American Job Center or anywhere else throughout the workforce system. So some examples of what you would assess are on the right side of this slide in the blue box that look at traffic and occupancy of the American Job Center. Look at preparedness for reopening the American Job Center in any capacity, whether that's by appointment only or on limited hours or fully open to the public. Also consider the presence of the required partners. Talk in advance during your negotiation process of how do partners plan to offer their services and where will those staff be located. Do they plan to be in the center or working remotely? That's helpful to understand the need for increased security. Obviously, the community environment, the broader environment, not just related to the pandemic, but any emergency or safety considerations, that should be incorporated into the discussion. And then the capacity of the existing security services, if you have them, or if you think you might need something in addition to, that should be a conversation among partners about what does that increased security look like or mean, and how is it different from the security that's already there. So these draft guidance points were developed in partnership with the Illinois Workforce Partnership and others who have provided feedback about these very questions. So we hope that this is an improved way of talking about whether and how increased security would be needed in any center. So then on the next slide and then the next section, we'll start to talk about the draft guidance for public safety measures within American Job Centers, and this is about what we have called the reopening checklist for reopening American Job Centers. The purpose of that checklist is to identify just a few requirements for safety purposes, and then offer additional guidance, which is just guidance, to support the local workforce boards and the required partners in making decisions about the availability of services within the American Job Centers and whether those should be reopened to the public when it's safe to do so. So this checklist, as I mentioned, was originally developed in May 2020, and it has been updated since then based on some new guidance that has come out by other sources, including the federal and state governments, and as well as feedback that you have provided to us about some provisions that may seem too rigid, or where more flexibility is needed, or where something was unclear. There have been revisions to that. So the supplemental guidance, the draft version, is suggesting just the fact that there is a checklist, incorporating that into more formal guidance, and acknowledging that it will continue to be updated as we all get smarter about how things are really unfolding. So I'd like to draw your attention to the next slide, a few of the minimum requirements. Anytime that partners in a local area are considering reopening the center in any capacity, whether it's just for staff or by appointment only or on limited hours or whatever it is, we think there are three things you have to do. One is ensure that there's adequate PPE available for staff and customers through phases 3 and 4, which align with the governor's Restore Illinois plan and those phases for safety considerations. We also think that it's important to ensure the safety of the staff and the customers, including through designated on-site security personnel, but again, knowing that every situation is different and that you have to that's a conversation to be had among partners about what security is needed. And then the third requirement is establish an agreed upon process for making decisions for a practical reopening that includes conversations between the leaseholder, the one-stop operator, and the required partners. We think that collaborative process is needed. We know that, again, when the shelter-in-place order took effect, decisions had to be made quickly. There wasn't a whole lot of time to have these collaborative processes. We're suggesting now it's essential as you continue to deliver services in all of your adjusted ways, keep having those conversations and really try as best you can in PY 2021 negotiations to understand how those decisions will be made going forward. So on the next slide, then we get into a little bit more about the concept baked into the rest of the guidance. So as I mentioned, what we just talked about were the 3 minimum requirements. The rest of the reopening checklist is guidance that can be tailored to the local area. But one thing to keep in mind is that the communications protocol should be clear. Hopefully it's starting to clarify now at this stage, but also it should be clear as you're thinking about PY 2021. That includes staff who are on site providing services in the American Job Center and staff who are working remotely but still making services available through the center. The important thing to think about is that the staff who are on site and who are working remotely deserve the same information about any risks that are identified, either through a risk of infection or a risk to public safety. All of those things need to be shared with staff who are making services available, whether that's in person or remotely. So that's just a reminder. The next section of background for the reopening checklist, as I mentioned before, the reopening checklist follows the same exact phases that are outlined in the Governor's Restore Illinois Plan. And each phase of the checklist aligns with the Governor's phases. We know that the state's currently in phase 4, but we also know that many of the American Job Centers throughout the state are still applying the safety measures that are described in phase 3. So we know for a fact, not all centers are going to be acting the same or advancing to phase 4 as fast as other areas or as fast as the state designation is. You have to do what's best in your local area, and this checklist is trying to allow you to do that and encourages you to do that. On the next slide, you can see here that the checklist incorporates guidance from various federal and state agencies. When this original checklist was developed and as it's been revised, it's been very important that a variety of perspectives were heard about what the implications of these guidelines would be. So special attention was given to make sure that anything that is in the reopening checklist does not contradict any other guidance that's issued either by the federal government or the state government. We want to cross-pollinate, in other words. We don't want to contradict, we want to cross-pollinate, we want to build on, we want to take what is already existing and bring it down to the level that you need in order to provide a very detailed understanding of how things are going to work in your local area. So we did insert links to the sources that are provided on the screen so that you know exactly what document was pulled from in order to get the guidance that is in the checklist. We also looked at what other states were doing and incorporated some examples that other states made available, and we linked to those as well so you could see the original source documents. And again, just think about whether what other states are doing applies to your local area. So on the next slide, we talked about how the checklist came about. Now this is where you can access it. It is located on the WIOA implementation portal on that website that's listed on the screen, the illinoisworknet.com/WIOA. And the red arrow points to the button or the bar that takes you directly to the WIOA implementation COVID page. So once you get to, on the next slide, once you get to the COVID page, there's some arrows that say COVID-19 individuals page, COVID-19 employees page, and then the red box is the American Job Center's reopening checklist. And you can note that there's two versions. The first version is the clean version. We call that the clean version, the without tracked changes. The second dot point in that red box is with track changes. So you can see the red line edits that were made from the previous version so that you can see what's new or different, so that you don't have to go searching through comparing word to word. We want to make that as easy as possible for you so you can see any new additions or clarifications or websites that were added. And then we also want to point out that on the right-hand side, you see a red arrow pointing up to the FAQs. That's what I mentioned earlier, the frequently asked questions. That's an ongoing maintaining resource for you that anytime the WIOA Interagency Technical Assistance Team or other bodies respond to questions in writing, that's where you find them. And that's where we encourage you to submit and look for responses about anything that we say today or at any point you're going through your WIOA implementation or negotiations. So these are the different resources, again, that I mentioned that are linked to the sources of other guidance that we incorporated and blended into the reopening checklist. And those are all hyperlinked, so you should be able to click on them and they'll take you to the website. Same thing with the next slide. These are additional resources that you can utilize if you think you need further guidance on some very particular things, like what kind of PPE is acceptable for employees or participants, or what other things do we need to consider about other safety precautions. We try to be as comprehensive, in any source we drew upon when drafting the guidance is incorporated here. I'd like to pause one second and share my screen to show you what the checklist looks like for those of you who are new to the checklist. Many of you have been using the checklist, we understand, but for anyone who is new, I'd like to just show you what it looks like and tell you one more, just on a high level, how it's organized. This checklist is the version that's posted on the portal now, and it describes the 3 requirements that I outlined in this webinar. And then it also says, after meeting those 3 requirements above, the checklist for reopening the American Job Centers in Illinois, it's not mandatory. And it offers examples for best practices and for what you can consider works best in your local area. The other item to note is that under the current environment, on-site security is required for some program partners to make their staff available physically in the center for their safety. So that's why it is recommended you have those conversations now and in PY 2021 negotiations about what are those requirements, or what are the implications if you don't have security, then can all of your required program partners be present? The other item to note in this reopening checklist is that the guidance is split into categories. So there's a service delivery category, procedures category, staffing category, and then there's subsections underneath each of those categories to say, okay, related to staffing, for example, what is that? What can we consider for staffing levels based on the volume of services in either phase 3, 4, or 5. What guidance exists related to that? So it walks you through what considerations you might have depending on what phase you are in your American Job Center. This is the other links that we already talked about. It also provides, some of the attachments in the document provide sample language that might support you in discussions at least about what signage is necessary, or what do we do when customers don't want to wear a mask, how can we handle that? Or what do we do if we notice that a customer who comes into the center is displaying some symptoms? How can we handle that? We know there are many resources about that, but we tried to provide some example language that you can at least talk about as you develop protocol in partnership with your partners in one-stop operator. We also offer an example of sample screening procedures and questions. So if you are opening your American Job Centers in any capacity to the public for in-person services, what are some screening procedures that you need to have in place if they're not already there? Same thing with, what happens if you actually have a positive case in the American Job Center, or the risk of infection is known, then what are the procedures you're going to use to inform staff and customers about how services will be provided? And there's the last attachment of the reopening checklist relates to maybe some staffing considerations of how you're actually going to manage these types of questions. So American Job Center staff should be trained and prepared to ensure the safety measures that are implemented within the center. So some examples, these are not requirements, these are examples taken from other states as well. As, for example, one-stop operator or a designee could serve as the supervisory of all these operational type considerations. And then maybe you also have a safety officer that can be, the in-person officer to help implement and enforce any of the safety protocol that are agreed upon in your center. And they would work with the supervisor in order to develop and implement those policies and safety precautions. That's just one example. It's not a requirement, but we hope that that would be helpful as you consider what staffing you might need if you don't have it already, as you consider PY 2021. So I'll stop sharing my screen here. We'll go back to the webinar, but I did want to just mention a little bit about that, what the checklist includes and looks like. So we are ready to move on. I understand we're doing a lot of talking now. So what we'll do is keep going on. I'll present the rest of the webinar, and then we will pause for question and answers. And I know that you are already typing questions in the Q&A box. If we don't answer them live today, please know that we'll consider them and talk about them and issue responses in writing after today's webinar. So I'm on slide 30 now, related to the supplemental guidance about universal design. We know that as services have moved on to an online platform or through other technology or through phones, it's important to consider the population served, obviously, which you do every day. But maybe think about some language that you can talk about with your required partners to ensure that all the potential participants can access services in a way that is most feasible for them. We know, again, that you've always considered that, but now that so much has moved online or so much has been delivered through technology, we want to consider how can we support you in talking about that as partners and thinking about what that realistically means for service delivery. So some feedback we received, and Interagency TA team members helped provide draft guidance for universal design of service delivery to consider individuals with disabilities or maybe senior citizens who are through the CSEP program who may or not be comfortable with technology. How can you consider that in making service delivery commitments for PY 2021. So universal design is defined on the screen here in the blue box, and also is described in the draft version of the supplemental guidance. It's the design and composition of an environment so that digital services can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. Universal design provides recommendations for meeting a range of physical and programmatic accessibility needs. It's a note that the universal design is not a regulation or legislation like it is with the American with Disabilities Act or the ADA, but it came about to address issues that are not directly covered by the ADA. So in some way, it's giving you a little bit more useful, practical information to guide your decisions about service delivery. On the next slide, it provides some links to the National Disability Authority, which provides more resources than are included in the supplemental guidance or the draft version. But what we wanted to highlight for you and what's highlighted in the draft supplemental guidance is in the blue box. These are the principles of universal design, that the customers can have equitable use, flexibility in that use, simple and intuitive use of whatever technology you're using, perceptible information, tolerance for error if an error is made, that they won't get locked up or prevented from filling out a form, low physical effort, and size and space for the approach and use for service delivery. So we hope this gives you, if you haven't had this language already, we hope this gives you some new language to talk about with your partners. And there are more links embedded in the draft supplemental guidance and on the screen here on the resources concerning universal design and how to apply it on the next slide. There we go. The Learn to Create Accessible Websites and Universal Design for Learning, and the difference between universal design and the ADA. Those are all resources for you we hope are helpful. We're ready to go to the next section of the draft guidance. This is about the one-stop operator payment provisions, and basically that's how to document the cost of the one-stop operator, and how, if partners are sharing in that cost, how each partner contributes to those shared costs. The background here on the next slide is that this topic of one-stop operator payment provisions date back multiple years to a DOL monitoring finding. And the next slide lists some corrective actions that DOL issued as part of that finding. Kirsten, can you, there we go. The corrective actions are listed on the screen here. Ensure local workforce boards award funds to the selected bidder of a competitive procurement process. That's clear regulation. The other is to clearly identify invoicing and payment processes in the contractual documents for procuring the one-stop operator. And then the third is ensure all local workforce boards award the funds to the selected one-stop operators with evidence of the exchange of funds. So these concerns DOL identified were originally, they're particular to the consortium model when multiple required partners serve as a consortium to deliver one-stop operator services. But any potential solutions that need to be considered, DOL has made it clear that any potential solutions need to apply to all one-stop operator models, regardless of whether that's a consortium model or a single entity serving as the one-stop operator. And DOL's primary point here is that the procurement of a one-stop operator cannot favor one type of bidder over another, so that it's a fair competition. And the procurement process and the one-stop operator agreement have to make it clear about how the one-stop operator will be paid, regardless of whether it's a consortium or a single entity. So that is all the background of how this section of the draft supplemental guidance came about. That finding has been out there. We've had to consider different ways to address that finding. And on the next slide, it says that the WIOA Interagency Technical Assistance Team is in continued conversations with DOL Region 5, and Region 5 is in conversations with the national office about potential solutions that do not add administrative burden or unnecessary financial transactions to demonstrate the exchange of funds between the local workforce board and the one-stop operator. So just know that there are continued conversations about that very finding and corrective action. But we know that those conversations will not be resolved by the time, one, we want to issue the supplemental guidance final version in November, and two, maybe not even after that. We don't know exactly the timeline that it will take to work with DOL to identify an agreeable and least burdensome solution for showing the exchange of funds between the local workforce board and the one-stop operator. So knowing that that conversation is going on at the state and national levels, we do think still that it is needed and a good idea to consider some improvements in the meantime. So on the next slide, what the draft guidance in the supplemental guidance says is on the screen here, but note that there's a red pending on all these slides that we're going to talk about related to the one-stop operator payment provisions. What the draft supplemental guidance suggests is that there are some good practices that could be implemented now, even before DOL and the state of Illinois come to an agreement on a least burdensome process for documenting payment. We think these are good practices anyway. So one is the MOU Section 10, which the MOU template has a section dedicated to the one-stop operator role. There is a few dot points that we suggest as new content requirements to describe in that section of the MOU template, and I'll describe those in a second. Another set of changes is to the one-stop operating spreadsheet, which we also call the MOU Budget Spreadsheet. There are two new revisions we think, again, could help improve transparency and allow both partners and the state and DOL to track how funds or contributions are made toward the one-stop operator if it's a shared cost among partners. And then the last area, which is number 4 on the screen, is invoicing process for the one-stop operator shared costs. What could a potential invoice look like to document the value of the services being provided and the contribution method by the required partner towards those services? Separate from what we are suggesting to be included in the supplemental guidance is another effort to align the supplemental guidance with the MOU commitments made and with the one-stop operator agreement. So the draft supplemental guidance mentions that there is a sample template that will be provided kind of separate but parallel to the changes that I'll tell you about next. So let's first look at the pending draft new content required in the MOU template, Section 10. This is not a major rewrite of the section, please know that, but it is just adding a little bit more detail to how the one-stop operator will be paid. So what are the terms of that payment process? What is the frequency of the payment for the one-stop operator services? Another proposed dot point is the total cost of the one-stop operator. That previously was not required in the MOU template. We're saying now the MOU template would be helpful to include that total cost of the one-stop operator so it's clear over the term of the MOU. I'm sorry, term of the one-stop operator agreement and term of the MOU. The other required dot point in the track changes that you see on the screen relates to which partners are contributing to the one-stop operator costs. We've been able to see a little bit or at least we can perceive which partners are contributing to it by looking at the one-stop operating budget spreadsheet. But we're saying it would be helpful to include that sentence in the MOU narrative so that we can confirm which partners are contributing towards the one-stop operator costs. And the last dot point that we're suggesting to be required is a method of contribution. It's not always clear exactly how the partners are contributing to the cost of the one-stop operator. So just spell it out with a simple sentence in the MOU narrative. That's what the draft guidance is suggesting. On the next slide is, and again, this is all pending, but wanted to give you a heads up about what's being considered about the one-stop operator payment provisions and invoicing. What the blue box says is that the required partners should establish an invoicing process to document the value of those one-stop operator services, regardless of whether that's a consortium or a single entity. And what the draft supplemental guidance is suggesting is there's two options that we could see working for how you document the value of the services and the contribution method. The first option on the right side of the screen is that there could be a designated invoice that is only dealing with one-stop operator costs and the contributions toward those costs, and show that here's the total cost of the one-stop operator for this program year. Here's the required partner's contribution method toward that cost. And yes, that might result in a $0 cash balance owed. And that's okay. It shows what the cost is. It shows that the partner is providing some kind of non-cash contribution and that there's $0 owed, but it's covered through the, we can trace that to the Mou budget spreadsheet. The other option is that maybe you partners send an invoice that includes multiple line items for multiple shared costs, but it's important to include a specific line item to that one-stop operator services, so that maybe the invoice covers many allocated costs to a required partner, but there's a very specific line item to the one-stop operator services and value. We will provide you more information about this as we are in conversation with DOL, but this is, again, currently in the one-stop operator, in the draft supplemental guidance, and we can provide templates for the invoices for you to consider if that would be helpful to your negotiations. Let me show you on the next slide what the budget spreadsheet revisions might look like. This is suggested to be a new row in the existing tab of the one-stop operating budget, which we also call the MOU budget. The arrows reflect new rows that call out specifically either the cash contribution partners are making towards the one-stop operator costs or the non-cash contributions that partners are making towards the one-stop operator costs. So those rows did not exist before. We're suggesting adding those so that it's very clear partners' contribution methods and which partners are sharing in those costs. On the next slide, the other change we're considering and would like your feedback about to the one-stop operating budget spreadsheet is a new tab in the spreadsheet specific to the one-stop operator costs. And what this shows you on this slide is that the tab could show the full amount of the one-stop operator contract by line item. So, what are the costs related to personnel and benefits, travel, equipment, or any line items that are applicable to your one-stop operator agreements. Training and education, direct administrative costs, total direct costs and indirect costs. we think by having this tab in the one-stop operating or the MOU budget spreadsheet, it makes it clear that your one-stop operator agreement has a budget for the whole term of that agreement. But the MOU budget spreadsheet, because it's an annual budget, shows the annual costs and contributions towards those costs by the partners who are contributing to that shared cost. So the one-stop operator agreement budget would be the total term of that agreement, and the MOU budget spreadsheet tab would be the annual contribution towards that cost. We understand that maybe without seeing how it fits into the actual budget spreadsheet, it's hard to provide feedback at this moment, but what we'll do is we can make a draft budget spreadsheet available so you can see how it would work and how it aligns, how this proposed new tab aligns with your one-stop operator agreement to see how you can fill in that detail. I'm almost done. The last section of the draft supplemental guidance relates to what a few things to remember as you begin negotiations, and a few things to remember when you prepare for your final submissions on June 30th, 2021. So the next slide shows you just a minor change of the pre-program year planning form. If you remember, this is a form that is required to submit before negotiations even really truly begin. It's showing you, showing the technical assistance team and showing your partners in your local area what the plan is for the negotiation period. What's the proposed process? What's the proposed timing? Who's the primary contact? It just kind of gives us a heads up about how you think you're going to go about your negotiations. The only new item on that pre-program year planning form is highlighted in at the bottom of the screen there that adds a new checkbox that if your local area would like technical assistance about enforcing safety protocols in American Job Centers, you can click that checkbox. It's similar to the checkbox above it that if you think, if your program staff or any agencies in your that are parties to your MOU need an MOU or a WIOA orientation, you check that box. These are simply tools to communicate to the technical assistance team what assistance your partners might need or what your staff might need in order to fully participate and understand the MOU negotiations process. So that's the only change to that form. On the next slide is a reminder that PY 2021 is what we call an amendment year. So all MOUs started over in program year 2020, which is the current program year. And those MOUs have terms of up to 3 years. So PY 2021 is a year when you have to amend the annual budget to the MOU. So the annual budget is changed annually, and then sometimes there are updates to service delivery commitments and the sections of the MOU template narrative that explain the budget spreadsheet. That's an annual amendment process. So that's what PY 2021 consists of. And in amendment years, the Illinois Office of the Comptroller requires a cover page on your MOU amendments to basically verify to the Comptroller's office that the underlying MOU still is retained as the vehicle for payment, as the contract for payment. So it's a simple thing, but when you prepare your submittals for PY 2021 MOUs and budgets, you have to include the spreadsheet. Otherwise, it prevents payment through the Comptroller's office. On the next slide is about the draft guidance related to signatures. The important thing to know is that during the shelter-in-place order, certain signature accommodations were made so that electronic signatures or block signatures with an X and a capital all block letters could still suffice as authorizing commitments made in documents related to WIOA. For PY 2021, we know some will still be working remotely. So what the draft supplemental guidance says in the orange box is that electronic signatures are okay on forms that go to the TA team. For example, the pre-program year planning form, electronic signatures are fine for that. Electronic signatures are fine for the report of outcomes, which is the form that's due on April 15th every year to say, have our partners reached agreement on cost sharing and service delivery for the next program year. And then the direct linkage checklist is also a form that is required that if your program staff will deliver services using direct linkage technology, you have to fill out that checklist and provide it to your partners to say, this is how we're going to make that a real commitment. This is how it's going to be implemented in reality. And signatures could be okay, electronic signatures could be okay on that. In the blue boxes, you see, and what's spelled out in the draft supplemental guidance document, is that the Illinois Office of the Comptroller does not currently accept electronic signatures, including signatures originated from DocuSign. And that would apply to the MOU because the MOU is a contract for payment through the Comptroller's office. The electronic signatures, including signatures from DocuSign, are not acceptable at this time. What we've been told by the Comptroller's office just very recently was that it's a goal to develop and implement procedures to accept electronic signatures in the future. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, exception procedures were put in place, which include, processes on if physical signatures are not possible. And that's what is included in small font. I realize it's very small font on the slide there, but it's also included in the document of the draft supplemental guidance. There is very specific instructions for agencies or vendors who need to submit documentation without a physical signature to the Comptroller's office, even during the pandemic. So that guidance is spelled out in the document, and as soon as there would be any new guidance or options available through the Comptroller's office, we would communicate that to you. But until then, this is the guidance that we have to comply with. On the next slide, this is the last slide of content that I'll present today. This is just a reminder about the timeline. Usually every year in the recent past, we've been issuing either the governor's guidelines if there's a major revision, or the supplemental guidance if that's just specific to a program year. That comes out in November every year. That is still the plan for this program year, that we will take your feedback that we get today through early November and work with their feedback to finalize the guidance, the supplemental guidance. Then we would issue the final supplemental guidance and have another webinar to say, here's the final version, here's any changes that were from the draft version, and here's how we incorporated your feedback. So that's still planned for November. Before Thanksgiving is the goal, and mid-November is likely. In December every year, that's when you need to start identifying who's going to be your negotiators for your MOUs, who's going to be responsible for being the lead negotiator on budgets, and fill out your pre-program year planning form to say, here's our plan, and ensure all your partners are aware of that plan and submit it to the state, the technical assistance team. That's due December 30th. And then in January, negotiations formally begin. As I mentioned, the next deadline after that is April 15th, when you have to submit a report to the technical assistance team to say, this is where we stand with whether we agree or not, and if we don't agree, here's why. And here's the issue so that the technical assistance team can offer remediation for the purposes of avoiding an impasse in how you're going to share those costs. Remediation would happen after that, usually in the month of May. Sometimes we have to move it different ways depending on the circumstances. But all final MOUs, regardless of how we got there, all MOUs are due June 30th, 2021. Then in the fall every year, so what we just finished doing was reviewing MOUs at the state level. So once final MOUs are submitted, they go through a review process by the WIOA technical assistance team to say what could you do to make sure that you're complete, compliant, and meeting the requirements of your programs under WIOA. So it's intended to be a helpful resource to you so that if your local area were monitored or when your local area is monitored, you can be confident that your documents are complete, compliant, and meeting all the requirements of your programs. So that happens in the fall every year, and you just received your letters recently about any required revisions to make sure that your current MOUs can be compliant. Okay, that ends the presentation portion of the webinar, and what I'd like to do now is offer some time for some Q&A. If I know we are going a little bit over here, so I'll do what we can in the time allotted. And again, please know that any questions I'm unable to answer here or any of the required partners who are on the call are unable to answer, we'll try to address those in writing. I'm going to pause and just read a couple of the questions before I speak here. Okay, so one question is a very good question. I'm glad to clarify. The supplemental guidance around one-stop operator payment provisions are going forward for PY 2021 MOUs. They're not retroactive to PY 20, but the clarification there is that the PY 2021 is an amendment year. So you would, if these, in the final version of the supplemental guidance, if all these one-stop operator payment provisions continue to be in the guidance, then you would have to amend your PY 20 MOU Section 10 to address those three dot points if possible. And if that would not be possible for any reason, then give us that feedback so we know. The other question is, we know it's October, and it says I'm still working on revisions to the MOUs, the current term of the MOU. Are any forms going to change, and do you need to start the process in December and January? Will the forms be available? The forms, any forms that would change that we talked about today would be issued with the final version of the supplemental guidance in November, so that you would have those to work with early in negotiation period if you need to. Okay, I think those are all the questions I'm able to answer at the moment. I'm going to pause and ask, Kirsten, are there any others that you wanted to draw our attention to that I didn't see?
There is one in the chat from Lisa Shavak. I'm not sure if you can see that. She had a couple different things she would like you to touch on, and I'm not sure, and it might be some stuff you already covered.
Sure, let me look through that. I see it now here now. Thank you. Says, can you please touch on the following two items of the guidance for shared costs that we presented when we were talking about the checklist for reopening American Job Centers? The first dot point she asked to touch on was the current health and safety environment on-site security is required for some program partners to operate within the American Job Center for the safety of their staff members. This is a point where, based on feedback we received about the reopening checklist, we understood that security differs in every American Job Center. And what we're saying here is that some state agencies, IDES for example, have certain requirements that security be on site before their staff can be present in those centers. So what we're saying here is just be aware and talk to your partners about what requirements are, what are the requirements for the staff to be physically located in the centers, and what are the implications if security is not available. Then will all your partners be able to provide, to staff and be present in those American Job Centers? That's all that's saying. Talk about it, be clear about it with your partners about who can be in there, or what the implications are if you don't have on-site security. The other point she asked me to touch on is where IDES holds the primary contract for security services in an American Job Center, additional or separate security contracts are prohibited. Consider arranging a dedicated entrance for center staff and customers who have appointments. This is purely out of safety, that if IDES has a contract for security services, and that's a shared cost in your MOUs, you can't just go out and bring in another contract for security. You have to work in partnership with IDES about how to provide the security. And then it is just a good consideration that there may be a need to create a dedicated door for staff to go in and out of, knowing that some of the customers are frustrated and stressed, and there needs to be a safe environment for the employees to enter and exit the building. So it could help to have a separate entrance. So those are the guidelines established in the reopening checklist for your consideration and discussion with partners.
Okay, I'm checking through. I don't see any other questions.
Okay, well, I know we did a lot of talking here. If we advance to the next slide, it provides my email address, and if I can get you to the right person, but typically remember we go to that FAQ site on the WIOA implementation portal, and you're able to submit questions through that FAQ. So whatever way you get your questions to us, we welcome them, we want your feedback about what's feasible, what's reasonable, or what challenges you would have if we were to include any of the pieces of the guidance in the final version of the supplemental guidance. So please, we welcome that. It's necessary for us to write guidance that's helpful to you, not overly burdensome. Okay. So with that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, with that, I was just going to close this out. So I just wanted to thank you, Bethany, for presenting this very important information to us today. And again, I wanted to reiterate that the presentation materials, as well as this recorded webinar, will be up on our website, and I've posted that in the chat. You can just Google Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and you can go to our WIOA page, and it will have all of our WIOA professional development. The same documents and recording will also be on the Illinois WorkNet website as well. If you are more familiar with that site, you can always access the materials there, and the materials will be up within 48 hours. I also wanted to reiterate that you will receive a follow-up email with the direct link to that website, as well as a follow-up survey that we would ask you just take 5 minutes of your day to respond about this webinar and the content. That way we can better plan our professional development in the future and give Bethany and her team some great feedback as well. And with that, Bethany, did you have any final words?
No, thank you for your patience as we go through this process and all the work that you're doing. I know that you've gone through quite a bit since the pandemic started, so thank you for all your work, and we hope to partner with you going forward.
Great, thank you so much. Everyone have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.